Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're going to get into the Sabaton history for a lifetime of war over the 30 Years' War. Like I said yesterday in the, what video was it yesterday? The Bismarck video. We are going to have some changes coming up on the channel. I've got a new camera that's about to come in and some stuff for the, set and all that. So things will look a little bit different in the next handful of days, but I'm glad the channel's been growing and I'm trying to kind of just keep up with everything. So that's going to happen. I have a couple of different videos that I'm working on getting out. Another Caesar video, another Hannibal video, another Sabaton song. So bear with me through all that. But today we're going to do the Sabaton history, a lifetime of war. Let's get into it.
The 30 Years' War, 400 years ago, pitted Catholic Europe against Protestant Europe.
And 30 years was pretty much what you would call a lifetime of war.
Two ways to view the world, so similar at times. Two ways to rule the world, to justify their crimes.
Starting with the Protestant Reformation that kicked off a century earlier, by 1618, the Holy Roman Empire had grown deeply divided into Protestant, Lutheran, and Catholic territories. But this mostly German empire, even though in reality more of a multicultural patchwork of many duchies and dioceses, was still technically an empire ruled by a single emperor of the Habsburg dynasty, and it was his duty to uphold the peace and the rights of his subjects. Emperor Ferdinand, however, who had promised religious freedom to the aristocracy upon his coronation, was going back on his word and now pursued a new policy of re-Catholicization of his crown lands. In mainly Protestant Bohemia, this meant closing down Protestant churches and empowering the lesser Catholic clergy once again. For the Bohemians, this did not just threaten the open practice of their religion, but the actual real power of the mainly Protestant landowners. As their protests were repeatedly ignored, powerful Bohemian aristocrats finally came together against Habsburg rule. In Prague, the Bohemian capital, on May 23, 1618, they took action and threw the imperial officials out of the window. Yep, this was the second defenestration of Prague. The word comes from Fenster, the German word for window. So to defenestrate is to chuck someone out of one. Okay, with this symbolic defenestration, they had, in actual fact, openly declared war on the authority of the empire. For the Czech patriots and anti-Habsburg radicals, this was a welcome chance to take up arms. Rebellious provinces sprang up all over. They secretly raised militias and hastily organized detachments of Bohemians, Moravians, Hungarians, Silesians, and hired mercenaries fell on imperial outposts and blocked their supply lines, hoping to gather support from yet other provinces with a series of quick successes. Protestant rebels even stormed the Hofburg in Vienna in an attempt to physically seize the emperor and force him to sign their demands. The rebels rejected Ferdinand and the imperial constitution and wanted a commonwealth of their own, like that of Poland and Lithuania, led by their own king in a constitutional monarchy. Their uprising failed, however, as the Habsburg emperor was not without friends and support. Imperial propaganda portrayed the Bohemian uprising as arch treachery that disturbed the peace of the empire, and many staunchly Catholic dukes pledged their allegiance to the emperor. Ferdinand had been caught off guard, sure, but he had no intention of giving up the crowns of Hungary or Bohemia, which might even jeopardize the structural integrity of his whole empire, and he was determined to go on the offensive, to quell the rebellion with fire and sword.
From dawn to dawn they're fighting, day will they stand. The fog of war I sleep, where armies scorch the land.
The war itself seems at first like localized rebellions over cultural and religious differences, but in reality, it revolved around the future of the Holy Roman Empire. Which was the primary Christian religion? Who had the power, the emperor or the dukes and their possessions? Political unity under one belief, or even more fragmentation with religious liberty? Ferdinand's strongest ally came from Bavaria. The zealous Duke Maximilian re-established the Liga, a covenant of Catholics, and raised an army with the blessing of the papacy. Under the command of his paladin, the Count of Tilly, they were eager to take the fight to the Protestants and forced them to battle in late 1620. The Battle of White Mountain was one of the first major engagements of the war, and one of the most decisive ones. Tilly's forces, better led and supplied than their enemies, won a major victory and then took Prague that winter. But as kings and dukes quarreled over cities, estates, and property rights, for the common people living in Prague and the villages along the trail of armies, the horrors that accompanied war became reality. And this was not a temporary situation, because this war is called the 30 Years' War, because that's how long it lasted. And
yeah, we've talked about this in prior videos, but the reality of war for the civilian population is brutal throughout history, and the 30 Years' War is no exception. You're basically taking the civilian population and putting them into a wartime scenario. They are basically fighting the war, right? Even though they're not, if they're not, they still are. They're still there. They're still a part of it. And all of the brutal, gruesome things that could happen to a soldier on the battlefield can happen to a civilian who's just caught in a bad place. And so it's a brutal situation all around. And it never ceases to amaze me how much I'm going to be careful about how I say this. How much older religious institutions were centered around power and money. Religious institutions were, for all intents and purposes, a geopolitical entity unto themselves. And so just like any other geopolitical entity, they have their own interests, they have their own power in the geopolitical landscape, and it never ceases to amaze me how big some of these conflicts can be that are centered mostly around power and money.
And it is often said about the war that the longer it went on, the more the violence and cruelty intensified. But really, the seeds of uncontrolled violence were already planted in the early stages. Discipline among the common soldiers was usually pretty low, and more so on the side of the rebels. Irregular forces particularly raged among the local populations. Polish skirmishers, Hungarian raiders, and Croatian cavalrymen terrorized panicked peasants and refugee columns.
Sure, you get that with all uprising wars, right? All wars that are kind of born naturally and amongst the population always has people flock to the banner that more or less just want a fight, right? And so you have this with all sorts of guerrilla forces, and you saw this in Spain during the Napoleonic Wars. Whenever you have groups like this or a war like this where it's born of the regular populace, you're always going to have people that flock to the banner that they just want to watch the world burn. And so you're going to have a lot of that.
Marauders and bandits roamed alongside the marching armies, and the enlisted soldiers were often not much better behaved. Especially after long and dangerous sieges, when pumped up and often drunk soldiers had been forced to storm a city under fire, they would afterwards take out their rage and fear on the locals. From house to house, they plundered and stole everything they could carry. If they did not find anything, or if others were quicker than they were, because it was first come, first serve when it came to plundering, they would turn on the helpless citizens. Men, women, and even children were brutally tortured for the slightest chance of hidden valuables. Since this was often the only way the soldiers could make actual money to feed and equip themselves and their families, they could not afford to show mercy.
as brutal as the reign and history of Genghis Khan is, that's one of the things that I think he gets far too little credit for, and that is the implementation of the new system of how plunder was to be taken. And it made the entire thing extremely organized. It made it it made it a lot less just rampant bloodthirst, and now that still would happen, but it was happening on like a directive, on orders. It was not the way that just cities were taken by the Khan, right? And that's one of the things that really changed the way that cities were taken. Because this is the reality of the history of, for forever. When cities were taken, especially if there had to be a siege, because that was Genghis Khan's thing, was if you surrender, you can live. But if you make us put together the siege equipment, everybody's going to be put to the sword. That is the way that this happens historically, but when it's just every man for themselves, it's so brutal. There are first-person stories written about stormings of cities and stuff like that. Golly, even all the way going back to Nineveh, writing about the fall of Assyria in the Bible. You hear about the storming of cities and stuff like that. And it's just a terrible, gruesome, last place you would ever want to be on Earth type of atmosphere. And if the soldiers aren't well led, if they're not well organized, if they don't have good discipline, then it's as horrific as you could possibly imagine.
Many simply embraced boundless, unchecked violence as a new way of life. The fall of Prague marked the collapse of the Bohemian Confederation, but the war itself obviously did not end, as the triumphant Ferdinand failed to take advantage of his victory. He would not listen to any compromise of his demands to restore his full authority. There was no chance for religious equality after the revolt, and instead, he condemned captured rebels to an agonizing death, while the escaped ringleaders were under an imperial ban. Together with the confiscation and distribution of rebel property, this just further escalated the war and drove many new Protestant champions to the cause of the rebellion. The war that began as a rather localized conflict in the east and center of the empire spread to the north in the 1620s. Imperial and Liga forces entered the zones of influence and interest of other great powers. In 1625, Danish King Christian declared war on the empire to secure his influence in northern Germany and portray himself as a Protestant savior. The Hanseatic League outright refused cooperation with the emperor and insisted on its autonomy and neutrality. The Polish sovereign Sigismund, on the other hand, was sympathetic to the imperial cause and introduced the Cossacks to European warfare, but also attracted the attention of the Swedes. In 1630, under the king and Lion of the North, Gustav Adolf, they set out to secure their interest in the Baltics. A strong Catholic influence in the north could not be tolerated by the ambitious House of Vasa, while Spain, themselves busy with Calvinist rebels, also sent out troops to help the Imperials. The French, who would rather see a fragmented Protestant Germany than a unified Catholic one, at first supported the northern forces with money, until in 1635, to prevent a peace treaty, they entered the war themselves. The war grew and grew, as did the armies, as did death and suffering. New knights appeared on the chessboard. Rich and ambitious men like von Mansfeld or Wallenstein aimed to get even richer through the war. Von Mansfeld tried to establish his own legend in the defense of Protestant liberty, while Wallenstein on the opposing side raised thousands of men for the emperor in his own pursuit of elevating his status among the nobility. War was business, War gave common but ambitious men a chance to rise in society. Experienced mercenary groups traveled from engagement to engagement and fought for the highest bidder. But the way to the top was paved with the blood and lives of thousands, then millions of men. Killing had become a normality, and authority broke down everywhere as the war expanded. Harvests were confiscated, cattle were slaughtered, people starved on the streets, and besieged cities even resorted to cannibalism. Peasants took to guerrilla fighting and formed robbery gangs and militias to fight off the marauders. But the major killer was disease. Where armies go, sickness follows.
Yeah, that's just the reality of the situation, especially in this time period. If you're going to have this many men fighting, traveling, all together in one group, you're going to have disease. It's just part of it. It's part of the death. It's part of the, mass of humanity. And what a crazy situation this is, where Europe is just kind of piece by piece pulling into this massive overarching conflict. It really is kind of brutal, and that's why I don't really like the idea that when it's solely framed as a Catholic versus Protestant thing, because let's be real about what this is. It's power and influence and money, and that's what it is. That's not to say that it was not deeply, deeply religious to some people. That is not why some people were fighting, because that is absolutely why some people were fighting. But overall, it's power and it's money. It's geopolitical movements and chessboards. And again, it's so ironic to me because historically this is referenced as the quote-unquote gentleman's warfare time. This is why I kind of have a hard time accepting that, because gentleman's warfare, if there is such a thing, is still the mass starvation of civilians, the slaughter of soldiers and civilians alike, and the breakdown of rule of law, and it's just awful.
And for every battle, thousands more died of a variety of diseases like plague or Hungarian fever. Rodents bred in the crowded cities. Wolves roamed the countryside, and cats and dogs disappeared in the kitchen. Religious hatred rallied religious zealotry, and many captured priests and nuns were murdered and mutilated. Popular acts of barbarism included pulling ropes so tight around people's necks that their eyes popped out. The Schwedentrunk was especially disgusting, forcing the victim to swallow large amounts of liquid excrement. Another fun game was to make criminals or deserters gamble for their lives and punishments. The lucky throw of dice would decide if a man lost a hand, his tongue, or his life. Trees were full of the other unlucky ones. There are only estimates as to how many people died, as records naturally lack specific data. The highest estimates are of a death rate of 40% of the population compared to the pre-war population numbers within the empire. But even with the lower, nowadays more often accepted numbers of around 15%, we speak of a war that was possibly, or even likely, the deadliest that ever raged in Europe by percentage, including both world wars.
Yep.
In the public conscious, it was not only a war, though, but a 30-year tragedy that ravaged the German lands and killed so many people, it would take many decades to replenish those lost. A whole generation of people lived through 30 years of war. From when they were born until when they were up to 30 years old, they knew no life but constant war and terror. And there were even soldiers that served from the beginning in 1618 to the end in 1648, often in different armies on changing sides, but still serving. And who could have predicted that the war would last so long? Between all the religious ideals and politics, who could have made sense of all the violence? Who could have avoided it? Who wanted to and who didn't? there was plenty of time to answer such questions. 30 years. 30 long years of war. So, Per, what are we going to see now?
We have some really amazing footage that pretty much nobody have seen. We shot a music video for a Lifetime of War.
Yeah.
Very few people know about it because nobody have seen it.
I didn't know about it. I haven't seen it.
I have not seen it because actually the footage was lost.
Well, lost? Like somebody left it on a train or something?
No, the guy disappeared. The guy who filmed it, he disappeared.
I'm sorry, that's
and
funny.
until today, we have not been able to obtain the original footage.
Okay.
So
So if he's out there, maybe he can return the footage?
that would be great.
That'd be great.
But until then,
Yeah.
we actually had our fantastic fan club in Poland, the Polish Panzer Battalion, who were there with us when
Okay.
we were shooting this. And they helped us to produce kind of behind the scenes of this.
Okay, during the video. shoot.
Yeah. What we're gonna see now is pretty much behind the scenes of a music video that never
Nobody's
became
ever
a-
seen.
I feel dirty. So fucking dirty.
Okay, well, and there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We hope you enjoyed that today. I certainly enjoyed it. That was totally new for me,
And that was supposed to be the music video for A Lifetime of War, which never happened.
which never happened. And maybe one day we will actually get to see that video if that guy brings back the footage.
Resurface.
Okay, well, thank you very much for today, Per. We will see you next time on Sabaton History.
That's it for today. Hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Sabaton History Channel. There will be another one every week until we run out of songs. It's gonna take a while. So until then, enjoy it, support us, become subscribers, become patrons, and see you soon.
Per's awesome. This is why I talk about and ask all of you guys about the monarchs in how they're thought of and what the modern states think about their royal line. The reason that conversation is at least important to me is because I see both good and bad historically in having a head of state in that way. Obviously, it's looked at nowadays when everything is very, very democratic. It's looked at as pretty wholly a negative, right? It's the phrase that absolute power corrupts absolutely, which absolutely is not true. There have been tons of historical leaders that have not been corrupted by absolute power, but it has happened quite a few times, and this is the negative, right? The negative is just off of what a leader wants to do or what a handful of leaders want to do, it can drag an entire continent, an entire world into war for decades, right? And the thought process is, if it was up to the people, would the war have really happened? Were the people willing to fight for 30 years on the Protestant Catholic thing, or was it the people kind of just wanted to be able to do whatever it was that lined up with their viewpoint or their ideals or religion or whatever, and as long as they could do that, then everything kind of would have been fine. So that's an interesting conversation. This was another good one. Again, all the ones with Per in it I love. So, but that was the 30 Years War by Sabaton History. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here, and I will see you all next time.